Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
This is the Adversary Universe podcast, and Adam, we are going to talk a little bit about physical security. What is going on? Are we tracking a lot of physical security practices, like in terms of adversaries getting into a building by stealing someone's card reader, or, the old, if you've ever watched Mr. Robot, like dropping a USB in a parking lot and using that as a mechanism to infiltrate your enterprise or their target, using some type of more physical approach to getting into that environment. Are we tracking that? Like, what does that look like, and what does that world look like?
We just recently, for our intelligence subscribers, we put out a report about MUSTANG PANDA, which is one of the threat actors from China. If you don't know our naming by now, hopefully you do. But they have been dropping USB sticks to gain access all across Asia Pacific.
Oh, wow.
So that is something that happens. In fact, with their USB specific approach, there's like it almost looks like a USB configuration app when you open up the USB stick, and then the user presumably is like, oh, I want whatever's on this USB stick. So they double click on that to configure the USB stick for their system, and then they deploy the malware, and it's game over. So we've definitely seen that from threat actors like MUSTANG PANDA. But we've also seen on the e-crime side that's pretty prevalent, where, a number of years ago it was really common that somebody would walk into a business or, a lot of tourism related things, restaurants, hotels, things like that. Yeah. And they would, slide behind the counter and stick a USB stick into the point of sale, the cash register.
Yeah.
Had it, and that would actually deploy a rubber ducky style kind of loader to then bring a keystroke logger or some remote access tool into the equations. We've definitely seen a fair amount of physical approaches to gain access to organizations.
Remember back in the day before USBs were like just everywhere and ubiquitous, that the same approach would be used with like a CD-ROM, where you would write something like HR records on that CD-ROM, and you'd put it in a break room and then hope someone actually pops that into their PC, and then the malware would launch on that. Now, I don't think you could even find a system that has a CD-ROM interface for you to actually load something up disk-wise, right?
I don't even have a DVD or CD-ROM. Like, that's like trying to find like a tape player
exactly.
or an 8-track or something. There's malware on those 8-track, plug it in. The other one that, this goes back almost 20 years now, but there was a pretty famous case where somebody was using, they were going into the parking lot of retail stores and getting onto the Wi-Fi, and then using that to gain access, which is kind of a physical attack, or, it's a proximity attack. And certainly cell phones are another one. There's things out there where you can intercept a cell phone if you're in proximity to it, fake base station, those types of things. Physical security and IT security are two things that have gone hand in hand for a long time. In fact, earlier in my career, when I worked in the government space, part of my job was to go around the world working for one particular agency. My job was to not only do red teaming and vulnerability assessments of some of these remote facilities, but I also had to do physical security, and this was all kind of tied to the NIST special publication, 853. We'd do these assessments. Part of that would include ascertaining whether or not they had appropriate fire suppression systems, or did they have appropriate physical security. So I was all over Africa, and I'd be like climbing up on the wall to see if they had placed shards of glass into the mortar on top of the wall so that people couldn't climb over the wall.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Crazy, really crazy intersection of physical security and cybersecurity. I was doing that in Togo, and I climbed up on the wall and I checked it out, and I could see that they had the broken bottles kind of cemented to the top of the wall, which is kind of, and as I dropped down, I didn't realize that there was Togolese military there, and there was two really frightened guys with a PKM, but they were the PKM, and they were looking at me like, "What are you doing?" And I was looking at them like, "What are you doing?"
What are you doing?
It's but physical security and cybersecurity have been kind of hand in hand for a while.
No, I recall meeting with enterprises in previous lives, investigating someone dressing up as, elevator repairman, for example, right? Walking into a building and using any type of open port like RJ45, right, to connect to their laptop and plug in and then kind of peruse that network, due to lack of like network access controls, for example. And that was fascinating, right? Where they would have this camera footage of this person walking into the building. And oftentimes I would wonder, like, who are they truly working for, right? Are these like people that are working on behalf of a nation state? Are they just part of an extension of an e-crime group, for example, that they are just trying to make some extra bucks? Like, what does that look like in terms of what is that hiring process to getting someone to actually have the nerve to actually walk into a building physically and do something like that?
Well, I used to do that when I was a red teamer too. I'd carry a letter that basically explained who I was and what I was doing. But I remember, there was one red team where we sat outside of this organization at lunchtime with a camera and just took picture of people walking by with their badges, so we could get a sense of what those badges looked like. And then this is back in the day, so I'll date myself here, but I used GIMP to make a fake badge and then printed it out onto a blank badge. And when I actually went to deliver the findings to this organization, I walked into the building and I used the fake badge to get in. And they were like,
Oh, no way.
how did you get in? And I gave them the badge and they were like, this isn't going to go well.
Oh my goodness. Oh man. All right. Well, let's talk about then though the adversary, right? When there is a true, like a real bad guy dressed up like, again, the elevator repairman or whoever, are they typically someone that is doing this? Like, is any crime group, let's just say any spider group, would they actually have someone on their team go into a building and do something, or are they just paying someone else to do or act on their behalf?
I think typically they're paying somebody else. Scattered Spider is an example where there was, some kind of physical, let's say a physical approach or a physical component to one or two of their intrusions, but they weren't doing it themselves. They were using cutouts, and you can recruit people off Telegram and places like that will do all kinds of things for some money.
For some money. Sure.
So you could say, hey, you're located in this location, I want you to go to this spot and do this thing, and they'll do it. So that's part of it. But I think if you pan back and you think about like, what are we, not trying to scare everybody here, but how do we kind of get our arms around this thing? There's, the traditional perimeter from a cybersecurity perspective, right? That's everything outside of your firewall. And then you've got everything inside of your organization and all of the different presumable, hopefully everybody's got some network segmentation going on, and they've got these kind of artificial or virtual walls up within their environment. But the physical space is really important too. And you got to think about things in terms of if you have an office building and you have guests coming in, Wi-Fi is certainly something that could be potentially targeted. And so you need to have adequate tools and rogue access point and rogue device detection going on within the environment. Yeah. You also want to make sure that you don't have, to your point, open RJ45s on the wall that somebody could just plug into, because a lot of times, people won't ask somebody why they're plugged in with a laptop. They just kind of assume that they're supposed to be there.
Yeah.
So, physical security is one of the boundaries that everybody needs to be thinking about for all of their locations. And then we all know about the USB stick that got dropped outside and somebody picked it up and plugged it in. So we have that. And then there's also somebody that recruits an insider, a physical insider, to go do something. I remember years ago, there was some activity that we blogged about. There was a blog, I think it was the French Connection or something like that we had put out. And we were talking about specifically, I think it was Turbine Panda in that context. And what we later found out from an indictment that went in, that there was a Ministry of State Security intelligence officer from China who had recruited a human asset to go into a target organization and plug in a USB stick that had, I think it was the Sakula malware. And their whole role as the malicious insider was to plug in this USB stick and deploy the malware. And then the remote operators took over. But when we put that blog post out, and if you read this indictment, they talk about the fact that this blog post went out. The Ministry of State Security officer reached out to their human asset and told them to delete specific logs because we had put domains in the blog post that were relevant to that operation. Wow. And all of this is in this indictment, but it shows that there is an overlap or an intersection between physical access from either trusted insiders who have been somehow compelled to do something, and then the cyber operation that follows suit.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. It sounds like to your point, having visibility across a multitude of systems that go beyond even just what we're seeing on the endpoint or identities. We're talking about like the card readers, understanding who's connecting to your environment. If someone just jumps on the switch, for example, this is kind of like a UBA type of story in the grand scheme of things, right? Like collecting all this data and starting to build models off of it.
8021X, making sure that you
802.1x,
have
switchport level
port
access control.
authority. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But I mean, have you ever done any dumpster diving?
No, personally, I think one girl broke up with me one time and I had to get my stuff. But
Was it because you told the wrong podcast?
that's a good joke. I
went
actually
to
do.
go look. I went to go look for that 9 to 5 podcast that we
No,
talked about.
that's actually a good point. That's my apologies. So on the previous podcast, I referenced my fiance's podcast and I said it was a spiritual 9 to 5. There is a correction. It's actually the inner briefing. And so there was an update to the name that I completely overlooked.
We were talking about podcasts, and I was trying to go find some additional podcasts to throw into the queue, and I was looking for something fresh, and I couldn't find that one. I knew she was the AI. Like, this is
Exactly.
obvious.
I know. I can't even prove that she's real now. But no, I wasn't dumpster diving for that. But tell me, what is your dumpster diving story?
I won't go into any specific stories, but I think it's relevant to say that dumpster diving goes back to the 90s. You know, that was even the movie Hackers, right? That was a big thing where they went through and were pulling reams of paper out. And
that's right.
So, you know, physical security is it's really all around the building. And sometimes these things overlap too with, you know, when there's a physical protest or something going on around your facility where you need to be careful. There's a lot of intersection. And this is where we talk to a lot of CISOs, we talk to a lot of CIOs, but one of the orgs that I do get an interesting conversation with from time to time is the CSO, the Chief Security Officer org, because they recognize that while the cyber security really falls under the CIO typically or something like that, that they still have a vested interest, at least from an insider threat perspective, around the physical security of their businesses and their operations, and how do they protect those physical security gaps from then leading to cybersecurity breaches.
I have a friend that is a vice president of security for a major league baseball team, and I always ask him, like, hey, are you looking for cyber threats that are tied to the physical world, like someone coming in? And he goes, absolutely. And he goes, my biggest concern are basically streakers in the middle of a live game. That's basically being, so, and I've been to a few games where that's happened and his team is deployed. And I'm like, what an interesting world where obviously
gotta chase down some like naked person flopping all their bits around. And
exactly.
There was, you mentioned Major League Baseball. There was a pretty interesting case a couple of years ago where I think one of their scouts or somebody left the team and went to another team.
I remember this. I do remember this.
They never disabled their account or something, and they were able to log in remotely.
That's right. And take data. It was almost like an insider threat in a way, right? Where they were taking some information that was pretty valuable to their new team and opposing teams. Okay, I have a quick question then around IoT as well, right? Because we're seeing it, everything has an IP address these days. And that same story of someone coming into a building and popping a USB into a system, I think is still pretty relevant. But I think it's a little more relevant when you have every TV, like in a boardroom, for example, that has like a USB port and an IP address, or anything that's considered smart, right? Or Bluetooth. That's a really good point. Exactly. And so, like, are you having conversations, and what are you seeing out there, right? Where adversaries, are they taking advantage of those systems? How is IoT kind of fitting into that?
There's a group we track as Slippy Spider, which was Lapsus, and
that's right. Yeah,
I think they're mostly in custody now. But one of their primary members, there was a story about how Arian Kurtaj had been sequestered in a hotel and was able to use a Fire Stick.
That's right.
To reprogrammed or was able to gain access to this Fire Stick in the hotel room, and then started using that to conduct operations while in protective custodies. There's no shortage of scary things out there, and I think that organizations, one, need to have that posture management and understand all of the devices that are connected and be looking for rogue devices.
Agreed.
Because lots of pen testers like to come in and plug in a Pineapple or a Raspberry Pi or another foreign device and use that as their kind of jumping off point. Mm-hmm. I've even seen, some pen tests where they tried to deploy something via a drone right, and fly a drone in
Instead of
with
building.
a
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
powered,
Yeah.
not even inside the building, but just, inside of the perimeter where they
Oh
could
yeah,
get a
outside the building, like
Raspberry
outside.
Pi with a
Yeah.
battery pack strapped to it and a Wi-Fi and a 5G, and then they connect into that thing, and then they can start doing Wi-Fi hacking from a device that got dropped inside their perimeter via a drone.
I worked for a company at the time was based out of Tel Aviv, and a lot of their focus was doing offensive security, using basically a rooted tablet, Nexus tablet. Yeah, it was really cool stuff. And we spent a lot of time messing around with an iteration of like Pineapple, right? Where we would show like, hey, guess what? We can do like man in the middle attacks with our poisoning or ICMP redirects, and here's what we can actually capture. And like, there's a lot of session hijacking capabilities within these tool sets, and it was a fun job. Like for roughly about a year or so, it was just doing a bunch of fun hacking into.
Yeah, I think it's important for any defender to have done some offense and
100%.
vice versa.
Yes, definitely.
Because you really appreciate, and even to like periodically go do a side project, you go grab something like one of these cool toys that comes out, Flipper or something like that, and just start to play with that and see what the art of the possible is. RFID is a whole other area where all these buildings have RFID readers, and there's things that can be done there. I remember for a while we were playing a lot with mag stripes, particularly as we were starting to see EMV becoming more prevalent here in the US, and mag stripes were still being widely used. So we started kind of looking at how are threat actors stealing data from the mag stripe in memory on the point of sales device.
Oh, wow.
Anytime that there's a physical boundary, an adversary is going to look to kind of cross over that, whether it be in person or using some technology to get over that boundary.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating.
You mentioned IoT, but OT is another space for that, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
oftentimes OT environments are isolated and there's not a lot of connectivity, hopefully, between the OT and the IT side of things. So sometimes they do need a physical device to get over that.
No, that's a very good point, especially for to your point, the systems that are completely isolated from like the network, right? And the objective is to kind of get hands-on access to those machines, right, in some capacity. So that is really
And I'd be remiss not to point out that there was a Russian threat close to 20 years ago now that was USB enabled. And for a while, I think federal agencies were epoxying the USB devices on computers so that nobody could accidentally plug in a USB stick.
That's like true device control. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Just shut it down completely. What do you think is kind of like you?
I was going to say, we've done some interesting stuff at CrowdStrike with the Falcon team, looking at how they do device control and protect against USB devices. And they were able to look at the power draw on specific USB devices to see, this one claims to be storage, but it's drawing more power. So perhaps this is actually not a USB mass storage device. And so there were things happening with that as well.
That's right. So we would pick it up as like some type of interface device, human interface device, right? Like a keyboard or something like that. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yep.
I love that. Yeah, I do remember that. That was that was years ago. Remember we built some capabilities around that. Yeah.
Well, and that has been useful in tracking famous Chalima, that same technology. So.
Wow. I didn't even tie those two together. That's fascinating. Huh. We have so many good stories, right? Of even just innovations that were driven by some evolving tradecraft that we've built capabilities around, and it's exciting. If we were to kind of wrap up today's session for our listeners on the risks of not having a good physical security program, and maybe some advice and closing remarks for how do you strengthen it, how do you evolve it, how do you kind of maintain that?
It really depends on the organization, but I'd say bridge the gap between, the folks that are probably, might be considered more the knuckle dragging security people that are doing the physical world stuff. We think about the boundaries and I say that affectionately, by the way, knuckle dragging. The physical boundary is another boundary that a lot of organizations probably don't spend too much time thinking about, right? They think about the perimeter with where the firewall and the gateways are. They think about where the perimeter between the enterprise and the cloud is, or the enterprise and the SaaS solutions are. But the physical barriers are part of that, right? And so understanding what IT is outside of some of these very protected spaces, and then tying that back to the insider risk program that oftentimes is going to exist within the CSO's office as well. What I'd say is one of the things that the cyber teams out there should be thinking about is reach out to the physical security teams, and if you don't have those relationships, start thinking about these problems collectively and show them some stuff that you're seeing from a technical perspective, and get them to talk about some of the things that they're seeing, because random person that gets caught wandering around the perimeter that might not be a security alert for the IT team, that might be something that they need to know about, right? They might need to be thinking about, oh, we've had 5 people that were unauthorized on the property, or when somebody gets terminated, that's the other thing. But when they get terminated, how do you address loss of control? How do you deal with them
completing that offboarding process, right? Basically. Yeah. Wrapping that up.
And the other thing I think that would be the most terrifying is those dead man switch type situations where somebody left a logic bomb or something like that in place, they get fired, and then kablammy.
That's going to be the title of this episode, kablammy. All right.
It's also the things around the building too. For a while I was playing with making Yagi antennas out of Pringles cans back in the early 2000s, and and Folgers cans and all different things. I have a hilarious video where we went up into the Washington Monument with a laptop and a Pringles can wrapped in duct tape. I don't know how we didn't get arrested. Yeah, but we made a video of us out there scanning around DC. This is like 2003 probably, scanning around DC with a Pringles can Yagi antenna to pick up Wi-Fi access points. And I'll never forget, in the video there's like some little girl walks by and saw me, and I was clean shaven, but I did have a ponytail at the time, and walked by, and I'm like holding a Pringles can and a computer, and on the video she goes, "Mama, I'm scared." It's like, a weird guy with a weird Pringles can up in here. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we're past the statute of limitations on this one. So that's amazing.
But so I mean, there's the physical boundary it can extend hundreds of meters outside of the facility, and you never know who's looking at your Wi-Fi and doing DOS attacks and trying to get access that way.
You mentioned on the previous episode when we were talking about AI, the use of AI models on the video side, right? Like security cameras right now, leveraging AI to identify if I'm looking at a dog versus a car versus a human, and now doing even like facial recognition. Do you think we're going to get to a point where all of that is just simply automated, right? Where you'll have kind of an inventory of faces that are allowed to get into a building versus, anything that's an outlier from that kind of starts to flag or send alerts off, and then...
it's there now, I think.
It's there, yeah.
There's a lot of privacy concerns around stuff like that, but the technology is 100%. I mean, think about it like a Nest
It's already
doorbell.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, you can load faces onto the Nest doorbell and be like, "This is Christian," and then when you show up and ring the doorbell, it's like, "Christian's here." Very low false positives, really, really good models on that Nest doorbell. And when you think about some of these more advanced security systems that you can put into a building, all of that's there, right? You have package detection, you have somebody put down a package and walked away from it as a detection, you have boundaries that you can create where somebody crosses over that boundary, and then you can automate action based off of that, right? Think about like what we do with
Fusion.
with SOAR and with Falcon Fusion. You can automate actions, right? So if a USB stick that's unidentified gets plugged into a computer running Falcon, you can lock it down. You can have it not load the driver for that particular piece of equipment, fire off a warning. So you could do all these different things. But you could do that with the physical cameras. I think you raise a good point there too, is that these things are becoming more linked together. So I think you'll see where like badging and video and all of these things will really advance what we're able to do from a physical security perspective. And I think that's going to drive the cybersecurity and the physical security teams closer together.
I love that. That's fascinating. Well, this is going to be a fascinating year, right? Of some amazing innovation, I think.
We're already seeing MUSTANG PANDA doing it in Asia, and we've seen criminal groups doing it. So this is something that as we raise some of the cyber perimeters and the cyber boundaries and make it harder for the threat actor, if that's an easier approach, if they find that there's an easier way to get in by pointing a Pringles can at a building from 200 meters away, or paying somebody to get a job as a cleaning person and come in that way, like these things are increasingly going to be the weakest link in the security chain. So you always need to protect that weakest link, because that's the path the adversary is going to take. It's the easiest path.
Really good stuff, man.
I wore a jiu-jitsu hat, by the way, for physical security podcast here. So
Adam, this is fun. As usual, I think we're having a lot more fun, and these are really great topics. These are topics that are coming up a whole lot more in just like conversation and dialogue with our customers, with people at different conferences. So I'm always curious. I think also for our listeners, if you do have some topics that you do want us to dig into, or if you're even suggesting a guest speaker, feel free to send over those suggestions. Adam, thanks for the conversation today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always a nice break from my day.
Yeah, it's a nice break from the going and goings. This is the Adversary Universe podcast. Again, give us some suggestions if you're interested in a few topics, and if we don't hear back from any new suggestions, we're just going to keep on a list of some really great topics that I think are pretty interesting that just come up day to day. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Adversary Universe podcast. See you later.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.